In the next few minutes, I'm going to take you through the entire 24-hour life cycle of a mature sourdough starter. If you're new to sourdough bread baking, my goal with this video is to help clear up any questions you might have regarding how a sourdough starter is actually supposed to work. I'm going to take you along every step of the way. As I start the clock, I'm taking 25 grams of mature sourdough starter out of the fridge. It's been in there for about 2 weeks, so it might take this starter a little bit extra time to wake up. I'm feeding the starter 50 grams of water, then stirring it around a little bit to dissolve the starter, and then 50 grams of white bread flour. I'm placing a rubber band on the jar to mark the top level of the starter so that we can see how the starter rises and then falls back down again during the next 24 hours. If you have a very active sourdough starter that you feed often, maybe you use it to bake a couple times a week, you might start to see the starter rising in the jar within the first couple of hours. But my sleepy starter on this particular day was taking an extra long time to rise. At the 7-hour mark, my starter finally began to show signs of life and started to rise, creeping up past that rubber band. Then, just an hour after that, at the 8-hour mark, my starter had almost completely doubled in size. It was about 80 to 90% risen. That just shows you that while my starter was rising very slowly, it took a lot of time to rise. Once it finally started rising, it did so very quickly and it started to shoot up. One thing to notice at this point is that my starter has sort of a dome-shaped top. As the starter rises up towards its peak, or the top point to which the starter will rise before it starts to fall back down again, it's going to start to change its shape. So the starter will rise up, and when it's about at the top or about at the peak, it'll have a dome-shaped top, and then it'll flatten out once it's at its peak, and then it'll start to fall back down again, caving in on itself like this. As a general rule, the best time to add your starter to your bread dough is when the yeasts are the most active, and that's when it's at its peak. So when your starter finally reaches its peak and flattens out, that's the best time to use your starter in your bread dough. But in reality, you can really use the starter when it's almost at its peak and it has a dome-shaped top, or when it reaches its peak and it's flat, or just after the peak and it starts to fall back down again. You have sort of a really big window of opportunity right there to use your starter and add it to your bread dough. So don't stress out too much about catching the starter right when it's at its peak. Anywhere around there is fine. You just don't want to use the starter when it's too freshly fed and hasn't risen very much, or after it's already fallen back down again. The best time is right near the peak point. Now at the 9-hour point, my starter had risen to its full potential and it had started to flatten out at the top when it reached its peak. This would have been the perfect time to add my starter to my bread dough, like I said before, but I wasn't going to do that today, so I just let the starter keep going. Then for the next hour, my starter sort of just hung out at its peak. The yeast became more active and I saw a lot more bubble activity in the starter, but it just sort of hung out at that peak point. This is what I usually see with my sourdough starter. It'll reach the top and it won't immediately fall back down again. It'll sort of just hang out there at the top. That's your window of opportunity. It gives you an hour or maybe even 2 hours where it's kind of at its peak. That's the perfect time to use your starter. So you really don't need to catch it when it's at its peak because you have time. It'll stay there for a little while. Well, it actually got late, so at this point I went to bed and came back to my starter the next day. We reached the 19-hour mark and my starter had clearly been falling down for some time. When your starter is on its way down, you'll probably notice the bubbles start to pop if you look at the top of the starter, and you might even see streaking on the sides of the jar, showing you that the starter had been at a higher point, but it's now been falling back down again as the starter ran out of its food supply and it's just sinking. All of that air is releasing from the starter and the starter falls back down again. As your starter reaches the end of its life cycle, it's going to keep sinking down and down even more until eventually the starter reaches that rubber band line once again. Here's my starter sinking down lower at the 21-hour mark. It's falling down even lower at the 22-hour mark, again at 23 hours. And by the time we had hit the 24-hour mark, the starter had completely sunk down to the bottom, almost to that rubber band line. And just to put some people at ease, I wanted to say this. Your sourdough starter falling back down again after you fed it is a completely normal part of the sourdough starter life cycle. I've gotten emails before from people saying that everything was going great with their starter. They fed it, it was rising till double in size, but then for some reason the sourdough starter fell back down again, Clearly it must be dead, the starter died because it sunk down again. But that's just a normal part of the sourdough starter life cycle. When you feed your starter, it's supposed to rise. When it runs out of food, it'll start falling down again. That's just the normal sourdough starter process. I don't blame you for not knowing this if you're new to sourdough bread, but just know that if your starter rose and fell down again, that's completely fine. You just didn't quite catch it at the right time to use it in your bread dough. Next time, try to catch your sourdough starter when it's near or at its peak and use it in your bread dough then. If you don't catch your starter at the right time and you accidentally let it go too far and it falls back down again, just consider it a learning experience. Discard half the starter, use it in a discard recipe, feed your starter again, and wait till it rises to double in size. Then use that starter in your bread dough. If you don't have your own sourdough starter yet, I would encourage you to check out this video I made a long time ago. It shows you how to make your own sourdough starter from scratch, and it just takes about 6 to 7 days from start to finish. Thank you to Cooey Housewares for sponsoring today's video. Cooey Housewares is a kitchen products and home goods store based out of Muskegon, Michigan. If you go to cooeyhousewares.com, you can check out the digital scale that I used in today's video, as well as a lot of other products that I've used in past videos. You can get 10% off of any of the products they have on their store using my discount code GrantBakes10. Make sure you go to cooeyhousewares.com. You can use the link down below and it'll actually automatically apply the discount at checkout, or just type in GrantBakes10 when you check out and you'll get that discount. Thanks Cooey Housewares, and I'll see everybody else in the next video.